The chatter of schoolchildren filled the biting winter air, their laughter bouncing off the stone walls of the Royal Guard's residence. Among the crowd, a group of teenagers gathered near the imposing iron gates, their breath forming small clouds as they spoke in low, mischievous tones. Across the square, seated on a frost-covered bench directly in view of the guardhouse, 91-year-old Arthur Bennett adjusted his thick wool coat and opened his book. Arthur came here every week, braving the cold for a ritual rooted in respect and nostalgia. He enjoyed the sight of the meticulously dressed royal guards standing at attention, their presence reminding him of the discipline and sacrifice of service. Today, however, his peaceful routine would be shattered. "Look at that old man," one of the teenagers sneered, pointing toward Arthur. "Bet he's got some story about the war or something." "Probably," another chimed in. "Let's go see what he's made of." The group moved in unison, crunching through patches of frozen snow, crossing the square like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. Arthur, engrossed in his book, didn't notice them until they were standing in front of him. "Oi, old-timer," the leader said, a mocking grin on his face. "What's that you're reading? Fairy tales?" Arthur looked up slowly, his steel blue eyes meeting the boys. "No," he said calmly, holding the book up. "It's a history of the Battle of Dunkirk." The group erupted in laughter. "Dunkirk? Were you there? Did you fight?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "I did." The laughter stopped abruptly, tension thick in the frosty air as the boys realized they had cornered someone who wasn't as frail as he seemed. Arthur's response seemed to embolden the teenagers. They leaned closer, their tone shifting from mocking to confrontational. "Bet you're lying," one boy said. "You're just some old geezer trying to make yourself look tough." Arthur's hands rested on his cane, his knuckles whitening under his thick gloves. "Respect costs nothing," he said firmly. The leader smirked. "Respect? What do you know about respect? You're sitting here while we're out there living life. Maybe it's time for you to go home." One of the boys kicked at Arthur's bag, sending it tumbling into the icy slush. Arthur inhaled sharply, but didn't flinch. From behind the guardhouse gates, a royal guard stood still, his breath clouding in the air as he locked eyes on the scene unfolding just beyond his post. Corporal James Hargrove had been stationed there for months, his duty to observe and protect the area. The moment he saw the group approach the elderly man, his instincts kicked in. James adjusted his position slightly, his gaze sharpening. This wasn't just a moment to observe, it was a moment to prepare. The group grew bolder, encouraged by Arthur's calm demeanor. One boy grabbed the book from his lap and held it high. "Give that back," Arthur said, his voice steady but firm. "Or what?" the boy taunted, waving the book above his head. Arthur stood, his back straight despite his age. "I'm asking you once." The boy laughed and tossed the book to another member of the group. They began a cruel game of keep-away, the book flying from one hand to another. Arthur's breath quickened as he watched the pages bend and tear. From behind the gates, James's posture stiffened. His training had taught him to assess situations, to de-escalate when possible. But as the scene unfolded, his hands curled into fists. He was moments away from intervening. "Hey!" James's voice cut through the frigid air like a whip, freezing the teenagers in their tracks. The teenagers turned as James emerged from the gates, his tall frame imposing in his immaculate uniform. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with authority. The leader scoffed. "What's it to you?" James's eyes narrowed. "This man served his country. You owe him your respect." "And who are you? His bodyguard?" one boy sneered. James gestured toward the guardhouse. "Royal Guard. And I suggest you hand him his book and apologize." The boy's expressions shifted from cocky to uncertain. The leader hesitated, then tossed the book onto the bench. "Whatever. Let's go." As the group retreated, James turned to Arthur. "Are you all right, sir?" Arthur nodded, his composure returning. "Thank you. It's not the first time I've faced worse odds." Hook. But as Arthur retrieved his book, he noticed something. The teenagers weren't gone. They were watching from a distance, plotting their next move. James lingered near the gate, his eyes scanning the square. He wasn't convinced the boys were finished. Arthur, too, was uneasy. He could feel their lingering presence, like shadows waiting to pounce. "You've got sharp instincts," Arthur said, glancing at James. "What's your name, son?" "James Hargrove, sir," he replied. "Royal Guard." "Royal Guard, eh?" Arthur's lips curled into a faint smile. "I'm not used to being rescued." Before James could reply, a rock sailed through the frosty air, striking the bench beside Arthur. Both men turned to see the teenagers emerging from the shadows, their faces set with defiance. "Looks like they've got some fight in them after all," Arthur muttered. James stepped forward, his voice cold and steady. "You've made a mistake coming back." The teenagers circled, their breath misting in the icy air, their bravado masking nervousness. James positioned himself between Arthur and the group, his stance firm, every inch of his training sharpening his focus. "Leave now, and this ends here," James warned, his voice low and even. The leader smirked. "We're not scared of you." "You should be," James replied, his tone deadly serious, his gaze locked on the leader with an unflinching intensity. The first boy lunged, but James sidestepped smoothly, grabbing the boy's arm and twisting it behind his back. The sound of the boy's gasp cut through the air, and the others hesitated, their confidence visibly faltering as they watched their friend wince in pain. "Let him go!" one of them yelled, stepping forward, but Arthur spoke before James could respond. "Enough!" Arthur's voice rang out, louder than anyone expected. He stepped forward, his presence commanding despite his age. "You think this is courage? Ganging up on an old man? It's cowardice." The leader's bravado cracked as he glanced at his friends, now shifting nervously. "We were just messing around," he muttered, his voice lacking conviction. "Messing around?" Arthur's voice was sharp. "I've seen young men like you before, full of bravado but empty when it counts. You want to prove you're strong? Try standing for something worthwhile." James released the boy, who stumbled back toward his group, clutching his arm. The teenagers exchanged uncertain glances, their boldness evaporating in the freezing air. One by one, they turned and fled, leaving the leader behind. "Go," James said quietly, his voice like steel. The leader hesitated, then nodded and ran after his friends, his head low. Arthur exhaled slowly, his breath forming a cloud in the cold. "Thank you, James," he said, his voice calm now. "I hope they think twice next time." But as James glanced toward the retreating figures, his jaw tightened. Next time, they won't have the chance. The square had fallen silent again, the chill of winter deepening as the day gave way to evening. Arthur, still seated on the bench, adjusted his coat against the encroaching cold. His book, now wrinkled and torn, rested on his lap, yet his grip on it was steady, his expression thoughtful. James stood beside him, his stance formal but relaxed. The lingering tension from the confrontation was ebbing away, replaced by an air of mutual respect. "Thank you, James," Arthur said after a moment. "You didn't have to step in." James shook his head, his breath misting in the frigid air. "It's my duty, sir, and it's an honor." Arthur's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I've seen men in uniform do great things, but it's rare to see one take a stand for something so small." James looked out over the quiet square, the snow-dusted ground glinting faintly under the dim winter sun. "It wasn't small to me, sir." Arthur studied him, his sharp eyes betraying a glimmer of pride. "You remind me of the men I served with. Brave, loyal, the kind of man who doesn't back down when it matters." James nodded, his voice quiet but firm. "And you remind me why we serve. It's not just for the country, it's for the people in it." The two men sat in companionable silence for a while, the soft crunch of footsteps occasionally breaking the stillness as passers-by moved through the square. The warmth of the moment contrasted sharply with the biting cold that surrounded them. Yet somewhere, in a dimly lit flat not far from the square, the group of teenagers sat huddled, their bravado now replaced with a heavy, uneasy silence. Arthur finally stood, his movements slow but deliberate. "Time for me to head home," he said. "I've taken up enough of your day." James stepped forward instinctively, ready to assist, but Arthur raised a hand. "I can manage," he said with a chuckle. "But thank you again, Corporal. You did more than just your duty today." James offered a crisp nod, his hand touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "Safe travels, sir." Arthur walked slowly across the square, his cane tapping softly against the snow-covered pavement. As James watched him go, he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride, not just for what he had done, but for the reminder of what it meant to serve. Back at the guardhouse, James returned to his post, the faintest smile lingering on his face. He knew the day's events would stay with him for a long time, just as they would for Arthur, and for the boys who had learned a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. And in the stillness of the square, as the snow began to fall again, the echoes of courage and respect lingered long after the figures had disappeared into the winter night.